Good afternoon, and welcome to the next installment of the Summer 2022 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at AAS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. As always, with me is AAS Programs Coordinator, Amanda Kondick. Today's guest is Michael Lawrence Dickinson, who in a few moments will share a presentation on his new book, Almost Dead: Slavery and Social Rebirth in the Black Urban Atlantic, published by the University of Georgia Press. And for those interested in purchasing their own copy of the book, the publishers have provided us with a discount code for the title, which will be provided shortly in the chat. For newcomers here, I'd like to say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society. We're a national research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed and produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room, as well as our digital materials to work on their own research projects. In addition, we offer regular programming like this one, and I invite you to join us for upcoming programs in the weeks and months to come. Please check out the link provided in the chat for a complete list of those programs. For this program, we are using Zoom webinar. And for those using this platform for the first time, my colleague Amanda will share some guidelines on some of the technical functions of Zoom in the chat. To open the chat, click the chat box icon located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. As a reminder to all, the program is being recorded and it will be made available on the AAS website and YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And now on to our program. Dr. Michael Lawrence Dickinson is an assistant professor of African American history at Virginia Commonwealth University. He was a 2019-2020 Barra Sabbatical Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's McNeil Center for Early American Studies. His research interests include enslaved Black life, comparative slavery, Black Atlantic studies, and urban history. Dr. Dickinson's book, Almost Dead: Slavery and Social Rebirth in the Black Urban Atlantic, was recently published by the University of Georgia Press and is part of its Race and Atlantic World series. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael Dickinson.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the American Antiquarian Society for this opportunity. And most of all, thank you to everyone here for taking the time out to listen to the talk today. I just wanted to start out by thanking you all again for taking the time. As these book talks tend to go, I'm going to start with sketching out the larger arguments of the book, and then we're going to go into particular specific portion of the book as we go along to try and get some sense about the larger thrust of the text. Now, the title reflected the words of an enslaved man and later Revolutionary War veteran Berea Brinch, who used the words "almost dead" to describe his physical condition as well as his social reality. He was later known as Jeffrey Brace, and he was held in Bridgetown, Barbados in the 1750s. I chose this title because his words spoke volumes of the diasporic struggle to survive for people of African descent in the Atlantic. The statement spoke again as much to a physical condition as to a social reality. The book uses the urban Anglo-Atlantic as an active window into the concepts of social death and cultural retention. Active precisely because the urban Atlantic served an active role in shaping and being shaped by captive social processes. This book is an effort to shed further light on how those enslaved piece together their lives in the Americas by establishing, shaping, reimagining, preserving their world in urban communities. This is a world in many ways socially apart from mainstream society, yet vital to enslaved Black survival. And more specifically, in the book, I argue that urban environments provided unique barriers to and avenues for social rebirth. I define this term of social rebirth, therefore, as the process by which African descended peoples reconstructed their lives and formed communities after forced exportation from West Africa. At issue then is the extent to which captives were able to rebuild and reconstitute fractured cultural and social ties, and how they're able to build new social networks upon memories of the old. The Urban Atlantic provides a valuable geographic framework to investigate the complex social realities of those bonds people whose lives influenced and were influenced by the Urban Atlantic. It was in these urban slave communities, within the connections between neighbors and kinfolk, that enslaved Blacks found the psychological resources necessary to endure the seemingly unendurable. Whether sites of first arrival, commodification, short-term sale, captivity, or lifetime enslavement, the Urban Atlantic shaped and was shaped by Black lives. It's only through a close analysis of urban communities and adopting enslaved perspectives that this interconnected world of the Black urban Atlantic, a network linking West Indian and mainland urban centers, becomes more clear. And for the actual book, I study 3 cities mainly in depth, and they include Bridgetown, Barbados, Kingston, Jamaica, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And above, you'll see an advertisement in a Philadelphia-based newspaper that should give some sense of these commercial ties. As you might note from the ad, it's selling a group of young bonds people, and mentions that they are both sexes, but the shipment comes from Barbados, likely through the port of Bridgetown. And so these are the commercial connections and these lived experiences that the book really tries to get at. Hopefully, if we have time during Q&A, we can get into discussion about why these cities and what we can extrapolate from these cities to produce larger arguments as well. The study begins in the 1680s as central cities, which I investigate, developed and matured. The investigation then concludes in 1807 when Great Britain and the United States both passed legislation outlawing the Atlantic slave trade, which dramatically altered the institution of slavery in Anglo-America. The book examines North American and West Indian urban slave communities to shed light on similarities, variations, and linkages between these communities. In the eyes of bonds people, the distinctions were often in degree rather than in kind. As is often the case, disjuncture between historical perception and lived experience abounds. I begin the book briefly in West Africa at the sites of social disruption, as we'll see in further depth in a moment, where Africans were robbed of families and friends, where their homeland rapidly transformed from the familiar to the remote. The studies then follows bonds people as they crossed the Atlantic and formed urban slave communities. And so as we delve into more of the specifics of the actual project, I thought it fitting to really begin where the book begins, which is in West Africa, at these sites of social disruption, at these spaces where we see this process of social fracture first initiate, as well as this process of social rebirth. Celebrations commenced in the Kingdom of Bawu, a territory likely situated along the Niger River Delta in present-day Nigeria. The rainy season had just passed as September arrived in 1758. As with every year, the people of Bawu prepared to enjoy a week-long series of holy days honoring the sun. In the kingdom's capital, Deya, a chorus of trumpets commemorated the sunrise and signaled the beginning of festivities. Sacrifices of fish, fruit, and livestock were made to thank the radiant star for its abundance. Meals of figs, dates, fish, cream, and palm wine were joyously shared among the community. Flutes, drums, horns, and an array of other instruments sent cries of elation into the air. As music played, the people danced and collectively formed circles, reminiscent of the aerial sphere of light that nobly watched over their days. The kingdom's warriors sparred with opponents for glory and prestige in the sight of their community and their deity. and the monarch appointed the kingdom's new officials, while the sun's rays engulfed the Jubilee. As was customary on the seventh and final day of celebrations, the local boys departed from their families to swim in the river, a rite of passage for every boy on the cusp of adulthood. Among this group of 14 sons of Africa, there was a 16-year-old named Berea Brinch. He vividly recounted his memory years later. Born into a noble family, his father held the exalted position as commander of the king's personal guard. The highborn man, therefore, participated in the festivities wearing ornate dressings of purple silk, scarlet fabric, and gold ornaments, attire which testified to his high standing in the community. Thus, it was truly a meaningful moment in Brinch's life when his father placed his regalia on the boy's head as the final day of the celebration concluded, and the group of boys prepared to depart together to the river. The proud father instructed the son to wear the ornament with dignity. Berea's mother, torn between a maternal desire to shield her son from harm and the knowledge that she must allow her boy to become a man, lovingly reminded her son to be careful in the fast-moving waters. Berea enthusiastically left home to join his friends. He swiftly bid his parents and siblings an energetic yet brief goodbye as they disappeared from his sight. Though this moment lasted only moments, it was the moment that would both haunt and inspire Brinch for the rest of his days. The company of sons reached the river mid-morning after traveling miles away from their village. Together they swam and competed in the water. Once the group became hungry, they contemplated returning home. They began to reapply their father's regalia when almost instantaneously a startling sight appeared. A collection of unknown men ominously looming on the shore. Fear immediately took a hold of Brinch as he sensed the impending danger. At first, he was stunned into paralysis as terror temporarily froze his limbs. Brinch's immobility soon gave way to action as thoughts of home propelled Brinch and his companions to flee toward the woods. The escape was short-lived. A larger company of 30 to 40 men was stationed in the brush to stifle any attempt of flight. In the blink of an eye, these sons of Africa lost everything and everyone they held dear in this world. Once captured, their limbs were bound while they screamed for help with no one to answer their pleas for mercy. Unfortunately, a mother's warm embrace was too distant to entreat, and a father's protection was far too removed to implore. It took a mere 5 minutes for the traders to gag the boys, load them onto a boat, and set sail down the river. Inscription into the Atlantic slave trade, rather than a celebrated return home after a harmless swim, concluded the boys' entrance into manhood. Berea's mother should have feared more than the treacherous currents. The river's true danger instead rested not in the fast-moving waters, but in its reputation as a conduit for human trafficking. During the Atlantic slave trade, water routes formed transportation highways, which helped merchants capture and move their human cargo to the ocean more efficiently than caravans through the wilderness. Major waterways like the Niger River Delta, like the Imo River, the Cross River, and the Niger River itself flowed directly into the Bight of Biafra. And if you can see my cursor here, we can see the Niger River Delta on this map. I make the argument in the book that it's likely that Brinch was captured and forcibly exported to the Bight of Biafra through the Imo River. And we can discuss in Q&A how I was able to sort of narrow that down and the detective work that that required to try to get a sense about exactly where he likely originated from or was born, and where his community actually existed. In Berea Brinch's life story, kidnapping was the beginning of an Operation Orlando Patterson, famously referred to as social death. But capture sparked a painful social process that was less permanent than death and more complex than mortality. Certainly, Brinch and millions of others were forcibly separated from their homeland societies, never to return. To be sure, loved ones were ripped from their grasp, never again to be embraced. Indeed, captives were injected into societies in which their racial ancestry and enslaved status precluded complete integration. But this process was more accurately a social fracture rather than a social death. For within these cruel realities, there were memories of loved ones lost and a further hope soon to be discovered. Brinch was captured, but this development was a compounding process of alienation. While many are familiar with the stories of the slave ship and the Middle Passage, the multi-step process of capture from West Africa to sale in the Americas constituted a series of social fractures as well, which were crucial to the lived hardships of captives. Once abducted, Brinch soon perceived that his hopes of returning home would not be realized. In the small vessel, his jaw cramped as he struggled to simultaneously scream and gasp for air. The cramped space in the boat meant bondspeople were almost piled on top of one another. Thus, the weight of bodies crushed Brinch's spirit along with his physical frame. The sounds of, quote, groaning, crying, and praying filled the young man's ears. Stricken with horror, grief, and pain, Brinch fainted. His body became covered with bruises and his limbs developed lacerations from the restraints. As the boat sailed down the river, so too did the young man's dreams of seeing home again. But Brinch resolved to survive and not wholly surrender to despair. He recounted his complex mental state, noting, quote, "Sometimes I courted death, but home would force upon me with all its delights and hope, that soother of all afflictions, taught me to bear with patience my present sufferings," end quote. Brinch considered the cathartic reliefs that demise promised. Though full of anxiety and sorrow, he was determined to endure by holding on to memories of family and a community so close to his heart and mind. Nonetheless, at the age of 16, the son of Africa was forced to leave behind a childhood of serenity for an uncertain future of despair. But Brinch was not alone in ultimately suffering at the hands of British traders. British ships transported upwards of 3 million captives from West Africa to the Americas. This equated to more than 1/4 of all African prisoners ripped from their homeland to labor across the Atlantic during the Atlantic slave trade. This was particularly significant given that this proportion was emblematic of the fact that Great Britain entered the slave trade later and also left and abolished the slave trade earlier than its European competitors like the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Bight of Biafra, where Brinch likely departed the continent, served as the most numerically significant region for the British slave trade. More than 1 million souls passed through this threshold onto British vessels, never to see the continent again. Now, shackles acted as physical manifestations of prisoners' minuscule chances of ever returning home shrinking. But acceptance would be a complex process, never fully complete and teeming with continual captive resistance. African traders often utilized cords to restrain their human cargo rather than the iron shackles typically associated with the Atlantic slave trade. Indeed, some African captors invented creative devices to stop their bounty from escaping. Log yokes, for instance, were cruel apparatuses affixed around the necks of prisoners to ward against flight, and these are depicted above. As one early 18th century British slave trader noted, quote, "When they bring any slave, they have a yoke or a great piece of wood made about his neck to prevent him from running away in the woods," end quote. Made of lumber, the weight of these instruments on the neck and shoulders would have been torturous to bear, without considerations of heat, lack of water, and scant food allowances. Another torturous device or apparatus used by some African kidnappers was a device inserted to the mouth to secure the tongue and silence cries of freedom. Others simply used a caulking substance known as oakum to gag captives as they were forced to march to the coast and quiet any cries for deliverance. Once inspected, sold, and reshackled with iron restraints by Europeans, prisoners were hastily taken on board slave trading vessels. The new restraints represented the chasm of doom widening. British ship captain John Hawkins described how prisoners perceived this moment in his 1797 voyage, stating, quote, "The slaves were put on board and necessarily in irons for this purpose. This measure occasioned one of the most affecting scenes I have ever witnessed. A change from cordage to iron fetters rent their hopes and hearts together. Their wailings were torturing beyond what words can express," end quote. Screams mingled with the cold sound of iron bolting. The prisoners' mortified wails conveyed the palpable tension at this critical moment in the life stories of African captives. Africans faced with the great threat of the wooden cage perceived that this new set of restraints were more than a change in holding patterns. Instead, the fresh shackles were weights pulling captives into increasingly desperate fate. And above, you'll see such shackles labeled A and B. Here, A is are depicted the wrist restraints, and at the bottom here, depicted in B in Thomas Clarkson's drawing here, we can see these are ankle restraints, and we'll discuss more about these other apparatuses later on in the talk. Now, once shackled, Brinch and his companions were quickly forced into the ship's underbelly. The sense of urgency in bringing freshly purchased human cargo below was more than an attempt to swiftly set sail. The ship's crew divided Brinch and the other young men, restraining them in different parts of the hull, certainly an effort to stop new arrivals from organizing any collective acts of insurrection. Therefore, he was finally separated from the last familiar faces he knew. Disorientation cannot begin to describe the seismic stress of alienation on the slave ship. Many West Africans, especially those from the interior of the continent, were unfamiliar with the ocean and with large vessels commanded by Europeans. Perhaps most critical to the African disorientation was the linguistic shock of the ship. Brinch, like many other enslaved Africans, did not speak English. Furthermore, the deliberate separation of bondspeople from similar ethnic groups created difficulties in communicating with neighboring prisoners. This was, therefore, a source of psychological anxiety beyond comprehension and worthy of reflection. Instructions could not be fully understood and questions could not be effectively conveyed. The panic of initial social isolation compounded the psychological loss and pain of loss as well as fear. Fortunately, prisoners often found ways to communicate nonetheless, in many cases aided by linguistic similarities. Brinch, for instance, recalled understanding and communicating with a number of prisoners on the ship despite being separated from his comrades. The iconic image of the Brooks slave ship depicted above provided a rare, detailed look into the gruesome eye of degradation. The 1788 illustration was famously featured in numerous abolitionist texts. The close-packed bodies depicted in the blueprints told the tale of countless victims, forever silenced. Africans were displayed in the drawing, as you can see above, neatly arranged as puzzle pieces. Situating Black bodies was a deliberate process on many ships. In fact, one former ship captain explained, quote, "I have known a white man sent down among the men to lay them in these rows to the greatest advantage, so that as little space as possible may be lost," end quote. As a result, prisoners were often, quote, "close to each other like books upon a shelf," end quote. Each expertly utilized portion of space meant less air, smaller rations, increased immobility, and greater shame. And so as we look at this, this depiction of the Brooks slave ship, it's important to note that this depiction actually illustrated the newly passed Regulated Slave Trade Act in 1788, which was meant to limit the proportion of prisoners or African captives that were placed on a slave ship based off of the size of the ship. And so if we look at the depiction here, there's actually an estimated 454 bondspeople on the ship. You can see how they're laid out in very tight spatial arrangements. I point this out because the captain of the ship actually acknowledged that before this point, despite that there are about 454 captives depicted here, he noted that he transported regularly upwards of 600 bondspeople in these confines. And so the larger point being that that as tight as we see these prisoners being packed in the illustration, it would have been far tighter prior to this point, and likely for the shipment that Brinch found himself in with his experience during the Middle Passage. So that gives us some sense of the spatial tightness, the closeness, and the suffering that Brinch and so many others endured. As new arrivals were added to the ship, the time of departure soon arrived. The waters of the Atlantic quenched any potential for return. While some captives were unsure of their destination, most perceived of the implications of leaving the continent. Captain Hawkins recounted this moment in 1797, stating, quote, "We were now to prepare for sea. Our vessel lay near a mile from the shore and our cargo was all on board, but a very severe distemper already threatened the slaves. They had become sullen and melancholy and discontented with their food and confinement," end quote. But the distemper Hawkins described certainly went beyond unease at their present conditions. Prisoners sensed the impending condemnation growing. Soon their homeland slipped from their grasp completely. Their will to return home could not combat the winds of the Atlantic, which would now propel them to a new land, a new life, and an endless struggle to survive. Thus, while the crew scrambled to set sail to the open waters, Bria Brinch, quote, "bid adieu to the African coast forever." In the ship, the space below was so cramped that the majority of passengers were forced to lay horizontally in the hull with poles confining their legs and chest on Brinch's voyage. The spatial tightness was typical of many captive quarters. Notably, before the late 18th century, British crafts created for transporting commodified persons were rare. Most British ships, however, were ill-designed to accommodate hundreds of human beings. Instead, most ships were retrofitted merchant vessels with alterations to increase the surface area below. The tremendously close quarters meant the sounds of screams were magnified and the stench of filth compounded. For the daughters of Africa who found themselves the unfortunate victims of the slave trade, sexual assault was a common injustice. From the moment enslaved women and girls stepped foot onto slave ships, they entered a realm of continual harassment. While the floating prison was a space of torment for all victims, sexual exploitation tended to be a gendered burden. This was an environment where African women regularly endured bodily violations. Slave ship captain and later term preacher John Newton poignantly described this succession of mental and physical abuse, writing, quote, "When the women and girls are taken aboard a ship, naked, trembling, terrified, and perhaps exhausted with cold, fatigue, and hunger, they are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. The poor creatures cannot understand the language they hear, but the looks and manner of the speakers are sufficiently intelligible. In imagination, the prey is divided upon the spot and only reserved until opportunity offers," end quote. Thus, female prisoners recognized that the vessel introduced new horrors as they boarded. Newton rightly characterized the arrival of West African women as a silent auction where crew members would make their claim upon their soon-to-be victims. Shortly after Brinch's ship set sail, the vessel's crew acted upon their heinous desires. Brinch noted that the crew members each chose a woman to brutalize. Refusal would certainly solicit violent reprisals or even death. And while many sailors forcibly escorted their victims to the crew living quarters, occasionally perpetrators decided to conduct their sexual torture in public view. Newton, for instance, chastised a sailor for raping a pregnant woman in public on board a vessel in 1754. He recounted the vile incident, stating that the crew member, quote, seduced a woman slave and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarter deck, for which I put him in irons. If anything happens to this woman, I shall impute it to him, for she was big with child. Her number is 83, end quote. However unpleasant he regarded the incident, Newton's reprimand was not issued due to the horrendous nature of the assault. Instead, he punished the predator for endangering the life of the woman because she was in an advanced pregnancy. The issue at hand was jeopardizing profit, not depraved abuse. Even pregnancy did not constitute grounds for sexual safety. The number 83 illustrated the callous disregard for human life inherent in the Atlantic slave trade. Many captains began assigning numbers to prisoners throughout the 18th century, rather than branding to keep track of their human cargo. For participants in the Atlantic slave trade, these were inventoried bodies rather than people. The worth of bondspeople was contingent upon their laboring capacities, not their mental scars. On Brinch's voyage, some sailors took pleasure in raping enslaved women in front of their husbands. In one such instance on the ship, an African man named Bled attempted to foment an insurrection upon viewing his wife violated. The African woman suffered having her body shamefully defiled in view of her husband in a sickening display of malicious cruelty. Her husband, Bled, exhorted his fellow African prisoners that an honorable death would have been a gift when compared with living with the present indignities. But instead of vengeance or justice, Bled was rewarded with 80 lashes and double restraints. The magnitude of this injustice can only be understood in the context of pre-colonial West African culture. Brinch, for example, described how the vows of marriage were sacred in his community. Infidelity was a reprehensible offense, and the punishment for adultery was death in his native village. Given the cultural weight of fidelity and the depravity of sexual assault, some women elected to commit suicide. This uncovers a critical issue rarely revealed in historical sources. Slavery stripped enslaved men and women of the intimacy culturally reserved for marital relationships. Certainly, there would be a glimmer of hope in the process of social rebirth, but that glimmer would emerge within a dense fog of anguish. As the enslaved woman Akiso, later known as Florence Hall, recounted, quote, death becomes so frequent an occurrence on the slave ship that it passed on without the fear of dying or grief of those left behind, as we believe those who died were restored to their people and to their country. Akiso's ethnic group, and likely Brinch's, the Igbo people, were among the many who envisioned life and death as part of a continuum. Death was a transition rather than a circumstance of finality. The spirit would return home after leaving this mortal plane, and those who lived a just life could expect an afterlife of contentment. Though the Igbo traditionally deemed suicide a dishonorable act, the group's cultural emphasis on the significance of land took precedence. More than providing sustenance, the lands linked the Igbo to their identity and to their ancestors. Forced separation from their homeland made suicide, in the words of scholar Chima Kore, an acceptable abomination. Therefore, a person who did take their life merely elected to end their tenure in this portion of the life cycle in favor of a landscape without the terror and torture of the slave ship. As can be imagined, these beliefs often frustrated slave traders. As an early 18th century British crew member complained, quote, their opinion is that when they die, they go to their own country, which made some refuse to eat their victuals, striving to pine themselves as the expeditious way to return home. To put a stop to this, the captain used this stratagem to show them he could prevent the returning home to their country. He ordered the carpenter to cut off the head of a dead Negro with his axe and fix it on a pole made fast to the ship's side. And there, the limbs about the deck, he threatened the same to all who would not eat their victuals. This took but little effect. They were yet forced to be flood over with whips to oblige them to eat. End quote. As the frustrated crewmen noted, only constant physical force contested continuous prisoner efforts to leave this earthly plane. The severity of reprisals depended on several factors, including the nature of the offense, the number of prisoners remaining, and the captain's brutality. Brinch noted seeing a small group of Africans separately confined when he first boarded his vessel. He concluded they were being scolded for offenses unclear to him. But what was clear is that these Africans exhibited behavior that alarmed crew members and potentially jeopardized the journey's success. Whippings, beatings, and additional restraints, as was the case with bled, were the most common forms of punishment. But crew members also repaid insolence with murder at times. It was not uncommon for captives to be whipped until unconscious as well. In some cases, crew members employed the aid of thumb screws. You can see above, depicted as C, D, and E here to the left of the illustration. This was an iron mechanism which positioned the victim's thumbs in a vise. The torturer would then turn the instrument until the bones were broken. Oppressors typically used the apparatus on rebellious Africans, including in rare cases upon children. And so you can see as these loops here where the thumbs were inserted, and then this screw here where the torturer would screw down in order to smush and crush the thumbs of those who were deemed rebellious and in need of some sort of reprisal. Given captives' desperation for food and traders' constant efforts to limit expenses, crew members on one 18th century voyage adopted a practice as gruesome as it was effective and efficient. An unnamed British crewman recounted, quote, "We caught many fish in the passage, especially sharks. One way to entice them was by towing aboard a dead Negro who they would follow until they had eaten him up. They are good victuals if well dressed, though some won't eat them, because they feed upon men. And Negroes fed very heartily upon them, which made us fix up several of them to save the ship's provision. In the grotesque exchange, the crew used a black body for shark bait and then fed the captured shark to his fellow prisoners on the ship. Notably, many of the crew members would not eat the shark, knowing the depraved manner in which it was caught. But this did not stop them from feeding the meat to other prisoners, to these prisoners on the ship. The starving captives readily devoured the fish meat, likely unaware of its ties to their departed neighbor, much to the delight of the crew, relieved that it helped save the ship's food stores. For captives, the perpetual hunger mingled with constant disgust. Many were frequently sickened by the constant movement of the ship, not used to extended seafaring ventures. Others became ill from the plethora of diseases frequently present on slave ships, including smallpox, dysentery, and yellow fever. The collection of human waste, oppressive heat, and spatial tightness meant these vessels were ideal breeding grounds for bacteria and pestilence. While crew members brought prisoners on deck periodically, the frequency depended upon the captain and the weather. Some ship leaders even forced prisoners to dance on decks for exercise purposes. Even when these unfortunate victims were allowed on the deck regularly, the intense heat, lack of hygiene, and sheer numbers of those restrained below meant that the air remained foul. Only a few openings in the hull and the grates of the deck provided ventilation. Surrounded by the smell of feces, urine, and vomit, and death, some Africans found it impossible to eat. Olaudah, for instance, was too repulsed to find food palatable. In his words, quote, "Under the decks, I received such a salutation in my nostrils I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was unable to eat. nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wish for death, the last friend, to leave me, end quote. Many were too grief-stricken to consider such sustenance. Regardless of the reasoning, whether out of outright rebellion, whether because of repulsion, or whether because of grief, those who refused to eat risked harsh reprisals. Equiano was force-fed, for instance, and beaten because of his refusal to eat. Crew members often doled out beatings and whippings to bondspeople unable and willing to consume these meager rations, and such refusals threatened to rob traders of their investment in human capital. Some captains of ships even employed the use of what was termed a speculum oars. This was an instrument inserted into the jaws of prisoners to keep their jaws open so that they could be force-fed. And you can see this above labeled on the right portion, if you could see my cursor, of the illustration. And this part was inserted into the mouth of the captive, and then it was cranked in order to keep their jaws open, and then food then inserted in order to force feed them. One British sailor witnessed, quote, food held in their mouths till they were almost strangled. For African prisoners, the choice even to eat was not their own. For Brinch himself, hunger outweighed mortification. The need for food engulfed him to the point where he was prepared to fight another young man on the ship for a morsel of nourishment. When he reached to grab the scrap, a neighboring African intercepted it. Brinch prepared to avenge the slight, but another man nearby intervened. He scolded the two young men, reminding them of their upbringing and rebuking them to conduct themselves worthy of their parents. Brinch became ashamed at the prospect of representing his loving mother and proud father poorly. Even in these cruel conditions, their lessons could not be forgotten or disregarded. Fights among prisoners were common, nonetheless, in the depths of these vessels. Disagreements over food rations were frequently the causes of conflicts, as illustrated by Brinch's confrontation. Access to waste receptacles were often sources of hostility as well, particularly among African men. Because they were frequently shackled by twos, this meant significant cooperation was required to reach the containers. Moreover, if one partner was too weak to make the trip across the line of bodies, this meant the counterpart may have little recourse but stationary relief. Thus, even bodily requirements became sources of frustration and confrontation. Now, it was under these circumstances that Berea Brinch and at least 12.5 million West Africans spent months at sea, with each day seemingly lasting a lifetime. Estimates vary, but more than 12% of those captives forcibly taken from the West African coast died before reaching the Americas, many from any of the myriad of illnesses rampant on slave trading vessels. Even such conservative estimates are staggering. English vessels transported more than 3.5 million unfortunate Africans across the Atlantic between the early 16th and early 19th centuries. This does not include the countless souls lost between the point of capture and the arduous trip to the coast. Disease, murder, and suicide ensured that the Atlantic and her voracious predators claimed millions of Black bodies. The confines of the hull could then be accurately characterized as aquatic graveyards. While consigned to an underwater burial, their memories endured in the families they left behind and in their fellow passengers. Now, for those who did survive the Middle Passage, the trip could range from 6 weeks to Embrace's case about several months, when he finally arrived in Barbados, Bridgetown, Barbados in particular. And you could see above a late 17th century depiction or map of Barbados. Bridgetown is in the southwest corner here. And this is where the ship carrying Brinch actually landed. Since most ships departed West Africa from slave trading centers along the West African coast, entrance into the Americas continued their journey into the Black urban Atlantic as the wharfs of Anglo-American port cities awaited new arrivals. The tragedies and indignities of Brinch's journey ushered him into manhood the most grievous way possible, stripping him of youthful innocence through unimaginable torment. He left the African continent as Bria Brinch, only to later become Jeffrey Brace through captivity in the Americas. Social death would remain a specter, always looming but never fully conquering. Anglo-American port cities would hold new trials, but also new possibilities to make bondage bearable. Hope, often unfulfilled, remained, propelling bondspeople into each new phase of captivity. Arriving at West Indian ports, bondspeople already bore the harrowing journey to the West African coast and endured the calamities of the Middle Passage, but their sojourn through slavery was only beginning. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. There we are. We do have a few moments for questions, so I encourage folks that would like to pose a question for Michael to add that to the Q&A feature. And I'd love to kind of just jump right in and get started. I know I've got a ton of questions for you, Michael. I'd like to get to as many as we possibly can. Like many of the talks we've conducted here over the past couple of years, I'm always interested in the origins and development of a project. And for you, I'm thinking of the various archives that you've visited, in the making of this book. I know that that experience led you through repositories and institutions in the US, the UK, Jamaica. I'm just wondering if you could maybe briefly share some of the challenges in conducting that sort of real transatlantic research, and perhaps maybe some anecdote of some special discovery or experience that you've had either in one space or maybe with one collection item.
Right, that's a wonderful question, Kevin. So I will say these archives in various countries are very different, right? It's a very different experience, or it was a very different experience researching Jamaica versus Barbados versus England and versus the United States. And so they all pose various challenges. I think a lot of it has to do with trying to approach the archives, finding these nuggets of information to understand what it is to be enslaved within these cities. I think in terms of the larger project, really it became born out of my initial archival work when I was a grad student many years ago. I actually stumbled upon Jeffrey Brace's narrative, and I was first looking at some of these commercial connections between Philadelphia and the Caribbean, and wanting to look more into how we understand this corridor of the slave trade that we don't really, our historians haven't examined a whole lot. But once I stumbled upon Brinch's story, or Jeffrey Brace's story, it was an aha moment, because it's a very human narrative that he tells us his perspective as someone who very much has an Atlantic story that passes through, as I just mentioned, Bridgetown, but also he becomes one of these sort of very dynamic figures. He's part of the 7 Years' War. He's part of the Revolutionary War. He moves across the Atlantic in urban spaces, and his story is a larger story of, I think, of the Black urban Atlantic. And so his story provided a far more human element, and that was really where the project took off. Really wanting to understand the humanity of what it meant to be part of this urban Atlantic through the eyes of these enslaved individuals, not just through commercial networks. Although the important part of the story, the human part of the story, really took over for me, and I think that's really the more so the topic of the book. And I'm very much more interested in the human element of this.
No, I think that absolutely comes through. I think through the, both through the larger testimonies that you've uncovered or that you've kind of re-examined, as well as the just tons and tons of fragmentary evidence that you find in newspapers and letters and ledgers and everything in between. I hadn't planned on going here, but I'd love to kind of continue on this idea of process while we're thinking about the human element, because I think it shows in your narrative that you are very careful about the way in which you weave in other stories into this, into this larger narrative that you're creating. And I'm wondering, from graduate school to dissertation to various revisions of this manuscript, how you really thought through the writing process, because I know oftentimes there are monographs, and it's largely in part because of the way in which we're trained in various programs. We can get caught up in jargon and historiographies and lots of added footnotes, and of course you have the footnotes there, if folks want to read them, but you're very careful about the way in which this narrative writes, and in a lot of ways, I would argue that this is a much more readable and accessible work than a lot of other works that might be on a similar subject. So maybe you could actually just kind of continue on with thinking through what that writing and revision process was like for you.
Certainly, and thank you. You're very kind. So part of what I wanted to prioritize with the book is trying to make it, as you mentioned, accessible, readable, to understand this larger narrative, and that the human story is very much paramount for me for this larger book, because I think what I wanted to do, what I wanted my readers to really be able to take to heart and really grapple with is inhabiting the world of these enslaved individuals, to really inhabit these perspectives that we can only. It's very difficult for us to really inhabit that space of enslavement, of this forced movement, of loss, of trying to reestablish and reconnect from being forcibly separated from cultures, right? And so I think language is a tool that helps us get there. And I think this question is a useful follow-up, I think, to your previous question, because when folks who do this kind of work, historians, they have to piece together these stories, and there are holes within that, right? There's only so much we can really glean. We can extrapolate, we can use other pieces of evidence to paint more of a composite picture. But I think language is also part of an important tool in our tool chest in getting there, right? In order for us to really inhabit this space in very real ways, so we can better understand what it means to be enslaved, what it means to be human within a larger system that denies humanity, right? And so that was something increasingly through my revisions that came to the fore that I really wanted to prioritize, and that required some editorial decisions. That part of a useful example here is when I discussed, Jeffrey Brace and his origins, and how I worked to sort of pinpoint where his community actually was in terms of geography. Much of that detective work is relegated to a footnote rather than in the actual narrative of the text, in part because that detective work takes away from the narrative flow, right? It takes away from inhabiting that space and helping us to really see things through his perspective and perspective of folks like him who are characters or figures, actors within the book. And so that background is in the historiography, and all sort of the many of those intellectual pieces are in the footnotes for some of the historians out there. But I also wanted folks who aren't traditionally trained historians to be able to appreciate these larger stories as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think a lot of graduate students often watch these sorts of videos, and I do, yeah, I think it's absolutely important to kind of work through all sorts of the decisions that we as scholars have to make as we kind of move that work along. I'm glad you brought up the larger narrative and these larger questions that the book's grappling with, because I did want to, before I turn to the audience, I did want to take you up on your invitation at the beginning of the talk by asking why you chose these three cities. And again, to remind folks, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Bridgetown, Barbados, and Kingston, Jamaica. What does a comparative study of these cities show us? And how much of this is largely afforded because of their specifically being port cities?
Certainly. There are a couple of reasons why the question of why these cities. Part of it really deals with these commercial linkages, right? So the majority of enslaved individuals who are captives in Philadelphia, they actually originate from the West Indies during the period of slavery, predominantly from Jamaica and Barbados, and predominantly from more specifically Bridgetown and Kingston, these major port cities that there is this major movement of bondspeople from the Caribbean to the mainland. And so these commercial connections are important, but also it was deliberate on my part to try to help us understand this sort of rigid divide between societies with slaves versus slave societies that Ira Berlin and many other historians have built upon. I wanted to help us understand the nuance and the complexities of those distinctions, that it's in the eyes of these enslaved individuals. I mean, many of these things are differences in degree rather than in kind. And so part of what I try to do in the book is help us understand that the system of slavery is more similar than I think we oftentimes give credit, that suffering is real in Philadelphia, that the system of slavery relies on force and fear as well in Philadelphia, despite this reputation that Philadelphia has as this beacon of freedom in the Atlantic world. And there is utility for seeing Philadelphia as this beacon of freedom, right? It's the first space in the Atlantic world to have an abolition law, right? The Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, and there are a lot of runaway slaves there. There's the first historical society, right? That in this part of the world that is actually founded in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So for those reasons, the moniker of the hub of liberty is useful for Philadelphia, but in so much that it's also a space of unfreedom, a space of oppression, a space of brutality. I think two things can be true at the same time. And so what I want us to understand is this movement back and forth that is true to the experiences of numerous enslaved individuals and populations, as well as the similarities and variations in experience that provides a lot of nuance and complexity of what it means to be enslaved in urban spaces in the Atlantic.
That's great, thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. I'd love to kind of keep going with this. And I know the book, sometimes implicitly and sometimes much more directly, talks about the ways in which the urban landscape was shaped by African descended peoples. There's a chapter in your book that specifically addresses punishment, which is just a heavy chapter at times. And you spend some time there actually discussing bondspeople who were held captive in prisons at these cities. And this was something that I learned from your book. I'd love just to hear a little bit more about what these prisons looked like, what function they served, how they looked within the cities themselves. And I'm specifically thinking of the High Street Prison in Philadelphia, but also that space known as the Cage in Caribbean cities. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you could.
Certainly. So I do not have the image here for the High Street Prison in
I just threw that at you. I'm sorry.
But no. But I encourage members of the audience. It's a very famous depiction, and part of what I point out in the book is this High Street Prison in Philadelphia. If we look at the illustration, you can see two enslaved men in the front of it being chastised for some unknown reason, right? And so they're in the stocks, and so what I want to highlight within that chapter, and I try to help us understand, is that this public nature of punishment is very significant, right, in urban centers, whether that's Philadelphia, whether that's in urban centers in the Caribbean. That is a through line, that this punishment has to be public. It has to be in spaces where free and enslaved individuals can see it and understand it, because these are threats to the status quo, in ways that are true for the institution of slavery in general, right? And so these prisons are central spaces in that regard, where executions take place, where enslaved folks are disciplined for their various for real or imagined slights or challenges to the status quo. And so really what I'm trying to help us understand through these discussions of prisons is that it's not just that these disciplines, these acts of discipline take place in prisons. They're part of a larger system of public punishment, right? And so in Caribbean centers, as well as in Philadelphia and larger cities, we have a common whipper, right? That's part of the public nature of punishment. That there are these larger, this larger system requires force and fear, regardless of where we are in the Atlantic. And the prisons are spaces that help us to better understand what is necessary to keep the slave system intact, regardless of what city we're discussing. And so delivery being a little vague there, hopefully folks will be interested in reading the chapter to look more into what's going on in these prisons and really how do we understand what it means to be the threat of punishment that looms large, right, for these enslaved populations in the cities, which is deliberate pushback. Because when we think about discipline, we often think about rural settings, plantations, right, in enslavement, but these cities were spaces where that took place as well, and it just looked very different and was thought about very different, but it's extraordinarily present and essential to the system.
Yeah, and I did want to add as well for folks that are interested in buying the book. Today's talk was a lot on the brutality and violence and that nature of the subject matter. But there's another part of the book that wasn't necessarily addressed, and that is one of hope and community, and ultimately the term that you dubbed social rebirth. So I wanted to just kind of throw out that term as well. We do have 2 more questions I think we can get to as we close up. Jessica Newman asks that she'd like to hear more about Black Alice and how the cultural landscape for African descended peoples changing in the 18th century, how that's demonstrated through her experiences. Pardon me.
Yeah, certainly. So Black Alice, or Alice of Dunk's Ferry, she's a famous figure in Philadelphia history. She lives for a very long time, past if we look at accounts past her 100th birthday. She lives into her hundreds. There's you can cast some doubt about exactly how long she lived, but she was up there, and she becomes this sort of local celebrity because she lives in through generations, right? She becomes this notable griot within Philadelphia. But part of what I do within the book is trying to understand how do we perceive the world through her eyes, right? She sees Philadelphia change dramatically, and part of what happens is a religious change as well. Probably when we get into the end of the 1700s and into the 1800s, because Philadelphia becomes the space of these first independent Black churches. Mother Bethel being the larger one, and we also have St. Thomas, and we have some figures that also become Richard Allen, Absalom Jones. They also become leaders of this cultural landscape, but also political landscape within Philadelphia. And so what we do see is as the century progresses, right, there's an increase in the Creole or populations that are actually born in the United States, right? And so that results in a greater adoption of Christianity and Christian principles in order to, I would argue, in order to supplement much of what is lost, right, within these generations, and what is lost within the process of forced migration and within this trauma of slavery. And so we do see as a cultural shift, a greater adoption of Christianity with fusing of West African principles in Philadelphia, and that becomes a larger process within the nation as well. I mean, there are studies in the present that really look at some of these connections between West Africa and Christian worship within the United States. I think that's the clearest way we see this cultural landscape shifts throughout the period, and so I think it's useful for us to really understand this, the eyes of Alice, because she sees all this within a lifetime, right? And her parents are actually they're actually on the board, the first shipment of enslaved individuals that come from Bridgetown, Barbados in the 1680s, right? And so she's very much a manifestation of this shift culturally in Philadelphia and later throughout the nation as we move forward through time and space.
Great. I'd like to kind of wrap up with just one last question from Angela Mitchell, who just posed, what's the next phase of your research now following this book?
So what's next question? So right now, my next project really looks at the domestic slave trade, an urban history of the domestic slave trade, looking at particularly at forced separation, centering around Richmond, and trying to understand what it looks like for enslaved individuals and populations to rebuild. And sort of, I'm really interested in this human story, not only of suffering but resilience, as is true within this current book that we're discussing now. But my next book is really looking at that within the domestic slave trade, and trying to understand what it means to inhabit the space of forced separation, and try to rebuild after these losses of family members, loved ones, friends, and the like.
Great. With that, I'd like to thank Michael for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Next week, AAS is hosting the History of the Book Summer Seminar, Black Print, Black Activism, Black Study, led by Derek R. Spires and Ben Fagan. We're going to have a couple weeks off for the month of August before we return. Our next public program will be taking place virtually on Wednesday, August 31st at 4 p.m. Please join us for the New England Primer, Perspectives from the Collection, featuring our own curator, Laura Wazowitz, our chief conservator, Babette Genrich, and Kyle Roberts. I hope everyone has a very safe and happy summer. Thank you so much for joining us.